Eleanor Grayson sat in her rocking chair. The creak of old would have familiar him in the quiet of her modest home. At 78, her hands trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from the weight of a letter she held. The paper was crisp, official, stamped with the seal of her son's attorney. It declared that Daniel, her only child, had assumed power of attorney over her affairs for her protection. It said, protection. The word tasted bitter, like the tea she'd left cold on the table. Her eyes, still sharp despite the years, scanned the document again, searching for a truth she feared she already knew. The house was too still. Once, it had thrummed with life. Daniel's laughter as a boy, the clatter of his toy trains, the warmth of her late husband, Thomas, reading by the fireplace. Now, it was just her and the ghosts of those memories. Eleanor's gaze drifted to a framed photo on the mantel, Daniel at 10, grinning gap-toothed beside her, and Thomas at the county fair. She'd raised him alone after Thomas passed, pouring every ounce of her heart into giving him a life better than her own. She'd worked double shifts at the library, saved every penny, and sent him to college. And he'd done well, too well. Perhaps. A corporate lawyer now, living in a sleek city apartment. Daniel had grown distant, his visits rare, his calls perfunctory. Yet she'd never stopped believing in the boy who'd once clung to her hand. The letter had arrived a week ago, slipped into her mailbox without warning. Daniel hadn't called to explain. When she'd finally reached him, his voice was smooth, practiced, like he was addressing a client. Mom, it's for your safety, he'd said. You're getting older. I just want to make sure you're taken care of. His words were kind, but they carried an edge, a rehearsed cadence that made her stomach twist. Eleanor wasn't naive. She'd seen the news stories, children taking control of their parents' finances, draining accounts, selling homes out from under them. But Daniel, her Daniel. She set the letter down and stood, her knees protesting as she shuffled to the kitchen. Her home was modest, a 2-bedroom cottage she and Thomas had bought 40 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was hers, fully paid off, filled with memories. She'd heard Daniel mention selling it once, casually, during a rare visit last Christmas. You could move to a nice retirement community, Mom. Somewhere safe. Safe. Another word that felt like a lie. She'd brushed it off then. But now, with the power of attorney in his hands, the suggestion took on a darker hue. Eleanor's mind raced. She wasn't helpless. She still balanced her checkbook, tended her garden, and drove to the grocery store every Sunday. But the law didn't care about her independence. Daniel had the document, and with it, control over her bank accounts, her property, her life. She sank back into her chair, her heart heavy. How had it come to this? Had she failed him somehow, raised a son who saw her as a burden to be managed? But then, a spark flared in her chest. Eleanor hadn't survived a lifetime of loss and struggle by surrendering. She thought of Margaret, her lawyer and friend of 20 years, who'd always urged her to plan ahead. You're too trusting, Elle, Margaret had said last year, her voice firm but kind. Let's set up a safety net, just in case. Eleanor had laughed it off then, but Margaret had insisted. They'd drafted a revocable trust, a legal shield that protected her assets and required oversight from a neutral trustee. Daniel didn't know about it. No one did, except Margaret. The phone sat on the table, its black cord coiled like a lifeline. Eleanor reached for it, her fingers steady now. She dialed Margaret's number, her heart pounding not with fear, but with resolve. Margaret, she said when her friend answered. I need you. It's about Daniel. As the evening shadows lengthened, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't powerless, not yet. Her son might have thought he'd outmaneuvered her. But Eleanor Grayson was no one's pawn. She'd raised him, loved him, and now she'd fight to protect what was hers. Margaret's office smelled of old books and lavender, a comforting contrast to the sterile chill of the letter still burning in Eleanor's mind. The lawyer, a wiry woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bob, leaned forward across her cluttered desk. He did what? Margaret's voice was low, but it carried the weight of indignation. Eleanor recounted the call with Daniel, the letter, the vague assurances of protection. Margaret's pen tapped rhythmically against her notepad, a storm brewing behind her calm exterior. He didn't even discuss it with you, Margaret said, more to herself than to Eleanor. That's not just bold, it's reckless. She pulled a file from her cabinet, the one containing Eleanor's trust. Good thing we planned for this. Your assets, the house, your savings, the investment account theory locked in the trust. Daniel's power of attorney gives him authority, but he can't touch anything without the trustee's approval. And that trustee isn't him. Eleanor exhaled, the knot in her chest loosening slightly. The trust had been Margaret's idea, born from late-night conversations over tea about Eleanor's fears of losing control as she aged. Margaret had seen too many clients blindsided by family, their life's work siphoned off under the guise of care. The trust named Margaret as trustee, with strict instructions, no major decisions without Eleanor's consent, unless she was medically deemed incompetent. Eleanor was far from that. Do you think he's after the house? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It hurt to say it, to think it. The cottage wasn't just a home. It was her anchor, the place where she'd mourned Thomas, celebrated Daniel's milestones, and found solace in her routines. Selling it would mean losing herself. Margaret's expression softened. I don't know his motives. Could be greed. Could be control. Could be he genuinely thinks he's helping. But intent doesn't matter if the outcome strips you of your autonomy. She flipped through the file, her fingers deft. We'll send him a letter, formal but polite, reminding him of the trust's existence. It'll put him on notice without escalating things yet. Eleanor nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in memories of Daniel. He'd been such a bright child, curious and kind, always trailing her in the garden, asking questions about the roses. When had he changed? Or had he? Perhaps the change was in her. In her refusal to see the man he'd becoming, a man who prioritized his own agenda over her dignity. That evening, back in her quiet cottage, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, a notepad in front of her. She wrote a letter to Daniel, not the legal one Margaret would send, but a personal one, from mother to son. Her pen moved slowly, each word a struggle. Daniel, she began, I raised you to be honest, to respect the life we built together. Why didn't you talk to me? She poured out her hurt, her love, her confusion, hoping the words might reach the boy she remembered. She didn't mail it. Not yet. Instead, she tucked it into a drawer, a silent promise to try one more time to understand him. But as she locked the drawer, her resolve hardened. If Daniel wouldn't listen, she'd protect herself. Margaret had already scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to review the trust's safeguards, ensuring no loopholes could be exploited. The next morning, Eleanor woke to a knock at the door. Her heart leapt, half expecting Daniel, but it was only the mail carrier, delivering a package of gardening supplies she'd ordered. Disappointment stung, but it fueled her determination. She spent the day in her garden, hands deep in the soil, pulling weeds with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years. Each tug was a defiance, a reminder that she was still here, still fighting. By dusk, her phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the caller ID. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. What would he say? Would he apologize, explain, or double down? She let it ring, not out of fear, but because she needed time to steel herself for the battle ahead. Margaret's letter would reach him soon, and then the real conversation would begin. The letter from Margaret arrived at Daniel's office 3 days later, its crisp envelope a stark contrast to the chaos of his desk. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. The trust. Of course. His mother had always been cautious, but he hadn't expected Thesa legal fortress guarding her assets, with Margaret as the gatekeeper. He leaned back in his leather chair, the city skyline sprawling beyond his window, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Guilt. Frustration. Both. Daniel hadn't meant for it to go this far. When he'd filed for power of attorney, it was supposed to be simply precaution. He'd told himself. His mother was aging, her memory slipping in small ways, like forgetting where she'd parked her car. He'd seen colleagues handle their parents' affairs, streamlining assets, ensuring care. But the truth, the one he barely admitted to himself, was that the cottage was a problem. Its value had soared as the town gentrified, developers circling like vultures. Selling it could fund a comfortable retirement for Haran. Yes, ease his own financial strain. His firm was struggling, his debts mounting. The cottage was a lifeline. If only she'd see it. He dialed her number, pacing his office. When she answered, her voice was cool, guarded. Daniel. Mom, I got the lawyer's letter, he said, forcing calm. Why didn't you tell me about the trust? You didn't tell me about the power of attorney, she countered, her tone sharp. Why? Daniel. Why go behind my back? He sighed, rubbing his temple. I was trying to protect you. You're alone in that house, and it's too much for you to manage. I thought. You thought you'd decide my life for me. Eleanor's voice cracked, not with weakness, but with anger. That house is my home, not a bargaining chip. The call ended abruptly, Eleanor hanging up before he could respond. Daniel stared at the phone, his chest tight. He'd underestimated her, assumed she'd trust his judgment. Now, with the trust in place, his hands were tied unless he could convince her to dissolve it. Back in her cottage, Eleanor sat with Margaret, the lawyer's presence a steadying force. He's rattled, Margaret said, reviewing Daniel's response to the lettera curt acknowledgement. No apology. He might push harder now. We need to be ready. Eleanor nodded, but her thoughts were on the letter she'd written, still locked in her drawer. She wanted to believe Daniel could be reasoned with, that the boy she'd raised was still there. But Margaret's pragmatism grounded her. What's next? Eleanor asked. We reinforce the trust, Margaret said. I'll file a motion to require a third-party evaluation of your mental capacity. It'll prove you're competent, shutting down any claim he might make to override the trust. The process was grueling. Eleanor met with a court-appointed psychologist, answering questions about her daily life, her finances, her memories. She spoke of Thomas, of Daniel's childhood, of the garden she still tended. The psychologist's report was clear. Eleanor Grayson was fully capable of managing her affairs. The trust stood firm, but the victory felt hollow. Each step widened the chasm between her and Daniel. She remembered his first day of school, how he'd clung to her, terrified, until she'd knelt and promised she'd always be there. Now, she was fighting him, her own son, to keep that promise to herself. That night, Eleanor walked through her home, touching the walls, the furniture, the photos. Each held a story, a piece of her. She paused at Daniel's old room, now a guest space, and sat on the bed. A dusty box under it caught her eye as childhood keepsakes. She pulled it out, finding drawings, report cards, a tiny baseball glove. Tears pricked her eyes. Where had she gone wrong? Her resolve wavered, but only for a moment. She couldn't let nostalgia cloud her judgment. Daniel had made his choice, and now she'd make hers. The fight wasn't over, but Eleanor was ready for her home, her dignity, and the life she'd built. Weeks passed, and the tension between Eleanor and Daniel simmered. A quiet war fought through lawyers and silence. Daniel didn't call again, but his attorney sent a letter requesting a meeting to discuss Eleanor's future. Margaret scoffed when she read it. "He's testing the waters," she said, tossing the letter onto her desk. "He knows he can't touch the trust, so he's trying to pressure you into compliance." Eleanor felt the weight of it all, the betrayal, the legal maneuvering, the erosion of the bond she'd once thought unbreakable. She agreed to the meeting, but only on her terms, at her home, with Margaret present. If Daniel wanted to talk, he'd do it face to face. In the house, he seemed so eager to sell. The day of the meeting, Eleanor woke early, her hands steady as she baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, Daniel's favorite as a boy. It was a small gesture, a bridge to the past, but she wasn't sure it would matter. When Daniel arrived, he looked out of place in her cozy living room, his tailored suit stark against the faded floral curtains. His attorney, a young man with a sharp jaw and sharper eyes, followed, carrying a briefcase that seemed to hold more than just papers. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice softer than on the phone. "I just want what's best for you." Eleanor studied him, searching for the boy she'd known. His eyes were tired, his shoulders tense. For a moment, she saw vulnerability, but it vanished as his attorney spoke. "Mrs. Grayson, we're concerned about your ability to maintain this property. A retirement community would offer better care, and selling the house would secure your financial future." Margaret cut in, her voice like steel. "Eleanor's finances are secure, and her mental capacity has been verified. The trust ensures her wishes are followed. If you have a proposal, make it clear." Daniel's attorney opened his briefcase, pulling out a real estate appraisal. The cottage's value had doubled in a decade, a gold mine in the booming market. "This property could fund a comfortable life," he said. "Daniel's only thinking of your well-being." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "My well-being," she repeated, her voice low but firm. "Did you think of that when you filed for power of attorney without asking me? When you decided my home wasn't mine anymore?" Daniel flinched, but his attorney pressed on, suggesting a compromise where Eleanor would move to a facility and Daniel would manage the sale. Margaret shut it down, citing the trust's protections. The meeting ended with no resolution, Daniel and his attorney leaving in a huff. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She wandered her garden under the moonlight, the roses glowing faintly. She thought of Thomas, how he'd loved this place, how they dreamed of growing old here together. Daniel's actions felt like a theft not just of her home, but of that dream. Yet she couldn't hate him. He was her son, her heart, even now. The next morning, Margaret called with news. Daniel's attorney had filed a motion to challenge the trust, claiming Eleanor's trust was created under duress. It was a long shot, Margaret assured her, but it meant a court battle. Eleanor felt a chill, but also a fire. She wasn't just fighting for herself now, she was fighting for every person who'd ever been dismissed, their voice silenced by those they trusted most. She met with Margaret to prepare, gathering documents, recounting every interaction with Daniel. The process was draining, But Eleanor found strength in small acts, tending her garden, baking for neighbors, writing in her journal. Each was a rebellion against the idea that she was frail, incapable, a relic to be managed. As the court date loomed, Eleanor pulled out the letter she'd written to Daniel. She read it again, her words raw and pleading. She decided to send it, not out of weakness, but because she needed him to know her heart. Whether he'd listen was up to him. For now, she'd focus on the fighter home, her life, her legacy. The courtroom was smaller than Eleanor had imagined. Its wooden benches worn but polished, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and wax. She sat beside Margaret, her hands folded tightly, her heart a steady drumbeat. Daniel sat across the room, his attorney whispering in his ear. He didn't meet her eyes, and that hurt more than the legal papers stacked before the judge. The hearing was to determine whether the trust could be challenged. Daniel's attorney argued that Eleanor had been coerced into creating it, that Margaret had undue influence. It was a flimsy claim, but the lawyer spun a tale of an aging widow manipulated by a cunning friend. Margaret countered with evidence, the psychologist's report, Eleanor's meticulous financial records, testimonies from neighbors about her independence. The judge, a stern woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, listened intently, her pen scratching notes. Eleanor was called to speak. She stood, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This house isn't just a building," she said, her eyes on the judge but her words for Daniel. "It's where I raised my son, where I buried my husband, where I've lived my life. I created the trust to protect that, not because anyone forced me, but because I know my worth." The room was silent, her words hanging like a challenge. Daniel's attorney cross-examined, probing for weaknesses, but Eleanor held firm. She spoke of her routines, her clarity, her love for her son despite his actions. When she sat down, Margaret squeezed her hand. "You did good, Elle." The judge took a recess, leaving Eleanor to sit with her thoughts. She glanced at Daniel, hoping for a Cigna glance, a softening, but he stared at the floor. She wondered if he felt shame, or if he was too far gone, consumed by whatever drove him to this point. Outside, during the break, Eleanor stepped into the courthouse garden, needing air. The roses there reminded her of home, and she knelt to touch one, its petals soft against her fingers. A shadow fell over her Daniel. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets. "Mom, I didn't want it to come to this," he said, his voice low. "Then why?" she asked, standing to face him. "Why take away my choices?" He hesitated, then admitted, "The firm's in trouble. I thought selling the house would help us both. I didn't think you'd fight so hard." Her heart ached, but her resolve didn't waver. "You didn't ask, Daniel. You assumed I was too old to matter." He looked away, and for the first time, she saw guilt in his eyes. But the moment passed, and he walked back inside without another word. The judge's ruling came swiftly. The trust stood. There was no evidence of duress, and Eleanor's competence was undeniable. Daniel's motion was denied, his power of attorney limited by the trust's oversight. It was a victory, but Eleanor felt no joy. She'd protected her home, but at what cost? That evening, she sat in her rocking chair, the letter from Daniel's attorney now just a piece of paper, powerless against her resolve. She thought of the future, of mending what was broken with her son. She didn't know if it was possible, but she'd try. She'd always try. Margaret called to check in, her voice warm. "You fought like hell, Elle. I'm proud of you." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I had to. For me. For Thomas. For the life we built." She hung up and walked to her garden, the night air cool against her skin. The roses glowed under the stars. Resilient. Like her. She wasn't done fighting, not for her home. Not for her son. Not for the woman she'd always been. Months passed, and the cottage stood unchanged. Its walls a testament to Eleanor's victory. The legal battle had drained her energy, but not her spirit. She tended her garden with renewed purpose. Each bloom a quiet defiance. Yet the silence from Daniel lingered. A wound that wouldn't heal. He hadn't called. Hadn't visited. Hadn't responded to the letter she'd sent. She wondered if he ever would. One crisp morning, as Eleanor pruned her roses, a car pulled into her driveway. Her heart skipped Daniel. He stepped out. Alone. His suit replaced by jeans and a sweater. His face haggard. She stood, wiping dirt from her hands, and waited. He approached slowly, like a child unsure of his welcome. "Mom," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Can we talk?" She nodded, leading him inside. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee, and she poured him a cup. The act familiar. Grounding. They sat, the silence heavy but not hostile. Daniel looked around, his eyes lingering on the photo of them at the fair. The same one Eleanor had clutched weeks ago. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I thought I was helping, but I was selfish. The firm's failing, and I saw the house as a way out. I didn't think about what it meant to you." Eleanor listened, her heart torn between anger and love. "You broke my trust, Daniel. You treated me like I was already gone." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to make it right." She studied him, seeing the boy who'd once run to her for comfort. He was flawed, human, but he was here. That meant something. "Making it right starts with respect," she said. "No more secrets. No more decisions about my life without me." He agreed, and they talked for hours, unraveling the years of distance, the misunderstandings, the unspoken fears. Daniel admitted his financial troubles, his shame at failing, his desperation to fix it. Eleanor shared her hurt, her strength, her refusal to be erased. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Over the next weeks, Daniel visited more, helping in the garden, fixing a leaky faucet, listening as Eleanor told stories of Thomas, of their life before. He met with Margaret, signing papers to relinquish his power of attorney, a symbolic gesture of trust. Eleanor watched him closely, wary but hopeful. She knew forgiveness was a journey, not a moment. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Daniel handed her a small box. Inside was a locket, engraved with a rose, a photo of them together tucked inside. "I found it in germanium," he said. "I thought it could remind us of what matters." Eleanor's eyes softened. She closed the locket, holding it tight. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for the gift, but for coming back to her. The cottage remained her sanctuary, its walls echoing with memories, but now holding space for new ones. Eleanor had fought for her home, her dignity, and in doing so, she'd reclaimed her son not fully, not yet, but enough to believe in second chances. She looked out at her garden, the roses thriving, and felt peace. She'd protected her legacy, not just for herself, but for the family they might still become. The stars above were bright, and for the first time in months, Eleanor felt whole. She'd faced betrayal, fought for her truth, and found a way forward not perfect, but hers. And that was enough.